being told about these plans, and yet it impacts even our breath as I share this with you. And so, you know, I'm super excited about this Green New Deal thing because finally people are seeing, wait a minute, there is an agenda going on, and what is this thing all about?
So what you're seeing though with ICLEI and with your metropolitan planning organizations and your councils of government that are literally all over the United States, what you're seeing is regionalization in action. This is how it's implemented through this organization, which is looking for ways to restrict your ability to use your natural resources and to have you rezone and re-general plan the center of your town so that it can only be used for very high density development. This is the purpose of organizations like this, to regionalize as an interim step to full globalization.
Instead of the human civilization expanding and boldly going into an infinite universe of real estate and energy, we are supposed to shrivel up on a planet under the UN's precautionary principle, a principle that considers all human activity and advancement dangerous unless proven not dangerous.
You can't move forward unless you can prove there's no harm. And so it demands that the government step in and say, well, there might be long-toed salamanders on this land. There might be. So you can't do anything till you can prove that there isn't. And of course, you can't prove the negative. You can't prove there are no long-toed salamanders. So the edict is, and it's used very conveniently for whatever excuse they may want to use it for, to simply stop people from using their property.
Under these new environmental laws ushered in by ICLEI and other foreign agents of the UN, all manner of federal grants were and still are being given to states, counties, townships, and cities in order to literally bribe officials into implementing Agenda 21 and its battle cry of sustainable development.
Whenever a higher level of government makes a grant and it looks like a bribe, it's because it is a bribe. It's also a threat. It's a means of acquiring addiction on the part of those receiving the grant. Once you get a person or a state at any level addicted to this easy money that's coming in from up above, they get to the point where they forget how to live on their own means, their own income, their own tax base, or whatever it is. And they're totally now dependent on the source of the money. So without anybody voting for it, without any change in the laws, without any revision in the Constitution, all of a sudden, whatever separation of power there was disappears. And it's the old saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Most of the U.S. population is not aware of any of this, especially Agenda 21. They are only aware that suddenly there is some new zoning law that inhibits their ability to get a building permit, requires them to pay 20% of their renovation budget for a wheelchair ramp or an elevator for the handicapped, or suddenly the stream across their street must be remediated and the state will be sending down a grant of $130,000 for the local officials to allocate as they see fit.
Every single issue that we face, whether in your community when you're doing the comprehensive plans, if you have a program to put in bike paths, if you have a program to control how buildings are constructed, and they always tell you it's local, local, local. One of the biggest problems we have is the use of facilitated meetings. Facilitated meetings are run by a professional facilitator who is trained in psychology, and he is trained, here is where this meeting's going to go. This is the outcome we're going to have. And he knows how to lead that meeting to exactly that outcome. But then they say, oh, the community decided this.
They actually create the plans for visioning meetings that direct how it is that your government is going to change the center of your town to the smart growth or new urbanism model, so that it'll be higher and denser. It's what I call vertical sprawl. And of course, they do your climate action plans where they're monitoring, metering, and controlling what it is that your emissions are. In order to manage your emissions, then they have to monitor them regularly and continuously. So this is the way this plan is designed. It's designed as a continuous loop for monitoring, metering, and managing the entire energy output and use of the world.
Before now, have you even heard of ICLEI? What about COGS, MPOs, or the ADA? How about human settlements or the Biodiversity Treaty? You are not alone. Few have any idea how the cancers of regulation have invaded the land of the free.
And when Agenda 21 not only uses our government as a tool contrary to our rights, but brings in foreign law and foreign influence to dictate upon the people and their states unlawful exercise of power, we are operating completely contrary to our established America. We're operating completely contrary to the rights of the people, and we will be destructive of our own future.
The Biodiversity Treaty was unleashed at the Earth Summit along with Agenda 21 in 1992. This treaty is considered key to sustainable development, and it sets forth the following rationale. The human race cannot sustain itself if it is polluting the water, air, and land of the planet due to overpopulation-induced CO2 buildup and fossil fuel-driven industrialization. Since the biosphere of Earth depends on an intricate and interdependent hierarchy of species, it does not make sense to antagonize or destroy the environment. This is reasonable, but what is not reasonable is extreme environmentalism.
This is the Biodiversity Treaty. It is 1,147 pages thickness of what is and is not sustainable in the 21st century. It talks about unsustainable things that human beings do. For example, power lines, ponds, fences, paddocks, religion. It talks about the unsustainability of the future because of population. It talks about golf courses, scuba diving, all these wonderful sports and skiing and all these things that we do as human beings. It's all unsustainable.
The Biodiversity Treaty was originally the brainchild of a radical environmentalist named Dave Foreman. He was the head of an organization called Earth First. He put together what was called the Wildlands Project. The Wildlands Project called for rewilding, their term, 50% of all the land in every state, back to the way it was before Christopher Columbus. Foreman's goal was to reduce the population to about 250 million people, and one of his dreams was to have the gray wolf and the grizzly have an unbroken line from Chihuahua, Mexico to Canada.
The Wildlands Project is one of those things that just sounds so crazy you can't believe that it could possibly be true. And it's the idea, which seems like a good one, that human beings should be restricted to specific locations and animals should be free to move freely through the world. And so because of that, then you have designs that require corridors, which are animal corridors, core areas for animals, and buffer zones. And these surround the islands of human habitation.
Under the Wildlands Project, vast tracts of land throughout the United States will be returned to the wild. Few or no humans will be permitted on tracts of land that could span the nation from Los Angeles to New York, Canada to Mexico. Humans can visit, but they cannot stay.
Take rural lands and put it off limits to human beings. We see that beginning to happen right now. Roads are being closed. Forests are being more limited. And the idea here is that you stack and pack people in metropolitan areas, you put them on public transportation, and you never let them outside.
Human beings are irresponsible. We are planetary villains, and therefore we need to create this Wildlands Project, a network of cores and corridors that are given, where the animals, the species, the plants are given priority over human beings.
This is the goal: islands of human habitation, or human settlements, or transit villages that concentrate human beings into specific locations so that animals can be free to move freely throughout the world.
All human development and support services, including roads, power lines, dams, farms, ranches, police and firefighting services, will be gone. Only wolves, suckerfish, spotted owls, and indigenous species will remain.
Extreme environmentalism is what we're seeing coming out of our colleges and universities right now. So the Biodiversity Treaty attempts to, in many cases, it will regulate to one species to the complete detriment of all others.
South San Jose is a good example of what's become, or is becoming, a wildlands project. South San Jose is called the Coyote Valley, and gee, some coyotes like to cross that valley, and some other animals as well. And so that's off limits to development. And we're seeing that kind of activity happening everywhere across this country.
But where will the humans go? Not to worry, Agenda 21 and its spawns have a plan. Recall we mentioned the United Nations Habitat 1 plan that came down at the Vancouver Convention in 1976. Under this plan, all humans that once lived on farms and in rural areas, so-called wildlands, will be relocated to cities, now referred to as human settlements.
And the idea is that if you concentrate populations into specific areas or zones, less energy usage, less water usage, and less transportation. So people will have less reason to leave home. They'll stay in their homes. They may even work out of their homes. And so they're not going to be using their cars, they're not going to be using energy, and they're not going to be using water.
Since, as we saw earlier, the UN is not big on property rights, it should come as no surprise that the first private property to be phased out will be single-family homes, what socialists at UN headquarters consider suburban sprawl. Instead, we the people will live in apartments and condos in megacities near railroad tracks. Our super-tall dwelling units will all be built to UN-specified building codes authorized by ICLEI, COGS, the ADA, and a myriad of NGOs and other friends of sustainable development. While the animals run wild in continental corridors, we the humans will live in transit villages and smart cities.
Smart growth, or new urbanism, is that ideology that says that you shouldn't have more space than you actually need. So if you're a couple of people living in a 3-bedroom house, well, you don't need that extra space. So why do you have it?
There's a clear, concerted effort to make it really just about as miserable as possible to exist and use your own private transportation, own your own home. All impetus and incentive, in financial and otherwise, is to convince people that it is unsustainable to live in your own home, have air conditioning. It is their duty as a human being, as a global citizen, you see. You basically exist and little more.
Our high-rise, stack and pack dwelling units, complete with smart meters and smart heating systems, will make sure no one uses too much energy. And if they do, the energy police, with help from the neighbors and eye-on-the-street surveillance systems, will be right there to handle the situation.
If they can put 1,000 people in one building, it's a whole lot easier to know what they're doing, where they're going, and how they're thinking than it is if you got 1,000 people living in a rural or suburban area. And so the stack and pack is multi-story buildings, multiple families living in the same spot, walking in and out of the same door, always being able to be managed. And smart meters play a big role in that management, as they can measure everything that you do in your life when you're using smart appliances.
If you have a garden or a single-family residence, while you're watering your garden, you maybe have more than one bathroom, you're taking too many showers, you're using more than your 10 gallons of water a day. And this is unsustainable. So you need to be removed from your single-family residence.
Anybody that's got a couple of acres of land and his own water supply and can grow his own food, these people are a threat to the collectivist society, because they aren't going to go to the politicians and say, please feed me, please clothe me, please give me shelter. That's the secret behind Agenda 21. They want people out of the country. They want corporations out there growing all the food and that kind of thing, but they don't want anybody living out there.
To describe human settlements and the food sheds that sustain them as modern-day concentration camps might be a little over the top, because with no cars, parking lots, or air travel, everyone will walk and use bikes, so they will be fit and healthy. At least as healthy as the genetically modified foods they are forced to eat will allow.
These islands of human habitation are surrounded by, of course, the continental corridors that wild carnivores can use to repopulate the continent, and all continents, in fact. So human beings aren't going to really want to be going out there into the wildlands area. And they're, of course, if you're a locavore, which you should be, under this plan, then you're not going to be getting your food for more than 25 miles away. And so that means that your transit village or your island of human habitation needs to be ringed by a food shed. And the food sheds, or of course you can grow your food hydroponically in a sort of a multi-story concrete parking garage kind of thing that you get your food in. But your food sheds are those rings of land that are around these islands of human habitation. And they have a limited amount of calories that they can produce. And if you're limiting the numbers, then you have to ask yourself, well, who gets to live there? And let's say you want to get married or have a baby. Do you have to wait for someone to leave or die?
In a universe of infinite energy, where the sun burns 4 million tons of hydrogen every second, and a gallon of seawater can be fused to provide the energy density of 300 gallons of gasoline, no good citizen would even think about using or wasting energy when sustainable development came to their neighborhood.
So it really is, how do you control where people live, and how do you get people living in these highly dense areas? Because according to United Nations Agenda 21 and these power elites, you and I need to be living where we can save planet Earth by living in a high dense community. And it's happening all over the United States.
But getting all the humans off the rural lands will not be easy. The UN's cohort of governments, NGOs and COGs, including the US government and hundreds of ICLEI-supported local governments, will have to do a lot of land confiscation. Not an easy task unless they're able to disarm the US population first. Luckily, a police state, especially a global police state, has many platforms and tools that cut across jurisdictional boundaries, as an ICLEI website proudly states.
In order to control mankind, we have to get them all into the big cities. We have to rack them up and stack them up, get them dependent on the state for their food, their shelter, their electrical power, their water, everything. That's the dirty secret behind Agenda 21.
We all know about takings like eminent domain, where the government wants to put a highway through your living room. But sustainable development Nazis and their friendly word-processing lawyers have come up with some interesting new ways to take your private property. One way is to create conservation easements and historic trusts.
Conservation easement and historic trust are two ways of imposing limited controls on private property. Conservation easement, like any other easement, says that there are certain kinds of uses that can or cannot be applied by the property owner. in order to do what? In order to advance somebody's theory of conservation.
Most people, when they hear the term conservation easement, it sounds like a good thing. Well, we'll offset. We won't use this piece of property for, the Rocky Mountain elk or whatever, or some salamander. So you're blocked off. If you join this easement, you're given money, an exchange of money, to say, I will not use this land for 90 years. But then when you die, the easement goes on, and people beyond you cannot use that property to how they feel and want to use that property.
And the experience that most people who have had in regards to this endeavor is that after 10 years, the terms of that conservation easement make the land worthless, or actually a cost to them. And so it's a process of beating the landowners down until lands are simply surrendered. Once you've given into a conservation easement, you're finished.
These entities are proliferating across the land as hundreds of thousands of helpless citizens who have been raped and pillaged now realize.
Conservation easements are used to promise farmers that if they sign a conservation easement, their land will be a farm forever. And I've never met a farmer yet who wanted to leave the farm. They want to leave it to their kids. They want to move on forward with it. And so they look at this, and they're under all kinds of pressure about what to do with their farms. So now they've come up with this plan to ease the pain of the farmers by signing a conservation easement. But they do it, it's signed in perpetuity, forever. And what the farmers begin to find out is, after a few years, all of a sudden they have nothing left to leave to their kids. They now have all kinds of regulations from the land trust they signed with about how they can grow crops, sustainable crop growth and that sort of thing. They can't survive because it doesn't work, and there's no way out of it.
The idea is this: any area, landmass, or territory a UN government or NGO wants to rezone as a California-type wildland or an historic mill in a place like Chester Springs, Pennsylvania, simply gets a circle drawn around it on the map. Then, Agenda 21 Nazis from some historic trust in Washington, D.C., or some ICLEI-sponsored COG offers farmers and owners of historic property bribe money if they will just put their property into an irrevocable trust and sign away the development rights for a good cause.
That particular piece of property, usually that comes up with buildings, structures of one kind or another. And so you're limited in making any kinds of changes there. So that freezes that particular property in a historic epoch.
Conservatives believe, in their country. We love our history, we love our heritage, and anytime we have a chance to preserve it, then that's what we want to do. Well, they've come up with this sucker move called National Heritage Areas. National Heritage Areas are promoted to protect something historic that happened there. The fact of the matter is, I haven't been in one yet that wasn't preserved already through, a presidential residence, something like that. And it's the same environmental groups and same NGO organizations that are behind this.
The farmer or property owner, needing money, because the water and roads sustaining his land have been shut down by the Wildlands Project, agrees to an easement filed against his property.
Property is taken for an easement. They only take a small strip of the property to be used, perhaps to put in a gas pipeline or something, a public utility. But it all comes down to a beneficial use of the property by the property owner is removed from his control.
Little by little, through a complicated dance of legal shenanigans and outright deceit, the trust eventually gains control over the farm, the rural land, or some historic Chester Springs property. The original farmer or victimized historic property owner is then kicked off his land or out of his house when some infraction of the trust covenant, such as improper windows, is discovered.
This particular piece of property, for one reason or another, or structure built on the property, has some kind of historic value, and you cannot change in any way that particular piece of property. Usually that comes up with buildings, structures of one kind or another. And so you're limited in making any kinds of changes there.
The animals and the Agenda 21 Nazis are now free to roam into yet more wildlands and historic properties.
I spent my entire career as a government appraiser, an appraiser of industrial, commercial, and residential property. And what I found in the year 2002 was that there was a revolution, a planning revolution going on. And it literally made it impossible to tell what property was worth or what you could do with it. Because even though it might be zoned for a use, you were not able to actually use it for that purpose.
There's no rhyme or reason. The whole law in this area is what I call reflexive law. That is, the law just reflects what they want to do. And so endangered species is now interpreted, along with the precautionary principle, to allow local governments to do or say anything about a land use.
So you might be zoned one way, but if your general plan says that you have to develop smart growth, well, you can't use it in the way that you thought you could, and you may end up having to sell your property to a developer, a favored developer, who's getting grants.
Permit discretion is another tool used by local governments. If they like you, you might get a permit. If they don't like you, you won't get a permit. And that kind of abuse isn't as recognized as it ought to be. It clearly exists. Those who've been victims of it know it exists. And those people need to speak out more because, without work by the early victims of Agenda 21, we all will ultimately become victims of Agenda 21.
But if conservation easements and historic trusts don't work, sustainable developers have devised other schemes to take property.
If you're out in the rural and suburban areas, you might be thinking, well, nobody's going to get me off my property. I'm here and I like it and I'm just going to keep living here. And sure, that seems great. But just think about this. Your roads won't be paved because your county has no more money. And so they're going to pulverize your roads and turn them to gravel. Or you're going to have your well monitored and you're being restricted on the use. You might actually not be able to afford your insurance anymore, or you might have your insurance canceled because you're in an area that's a fire area. You might find that you're not able to continue to pay the taxes for the sheriff and for the hospital and for all the other services that you have out there in the county because other people have been removed from their land through restrictions on their use or through fire or other situations that have occurred and make it so that very few people are out there and they're carrying the entire tax burden. So then you're finding that you're not able to actually maintain the land that you're on, and you'll find that you're moved off of your land and moved into the city.
How does it help the Wildlands Project? It sets up more of those priority development areas that are then going to be connected by a corridor. And then you have this whole network across the United States that is now going back to that Wildlands Project map.
In 2006, 5 black robes decided that if a community can better use the land, then it's okay to take it, use eminent domain and take it. As soon as that decision was made, across the country, thousands of decisions using eminent domain were made. Why? Why would they ignore every precedent that was ever done in every court case in the Supreme Court about private property and every line ever written by our founding fathers about private property? Why would they eliminate that? The truth of the matter is they had to do it in order to implement sustainable development. And in that day, private property in America died.
America is under siege. The globalists bought off the corporate media. They are literally enemies of the people. They know what they're doing. And they are selectively deciding what they want to burn down and what they want to destroy and what they want to take over.
You'll see in fire areas that lands are, more and more land is owned by the federal government, the state government, and the county governments. And they're not clearing out the undergrowth. They're not maintaining the forests. And so they're more susceptible to fire danger. And the fires are larger and are moving more quickly because the undergrowth is not being removed. So people out in rural areas might find that they're restricted in whether they can return to their properties or not.
You burn out the areas you want first, outside Austin, they're going to be the most valuable later. You burn out all the poor areas, you burn them to the ground with forced gentrification, and then you come in behind it. Look at the overlaid map of the UN Agenda 21, where they would not allow fire breaks and rewilding, and match where the fires are.
Before America was America, there were Native Americans that roamed this nation from one end to the other, and they culled and they used the resources in these forests. Government has now created a situation where they say the best, most environmentally friendly thing that we can do is to keep humans out of these areas. So as they restrict many hundreds of acres from forestry management of any kind, hunting, recreation, even housing, we're creating a disaster. These forests are filled with fuel, and let's face it, one lightning strike and these things go up and it burns. The fire does not know boundaries. It burns off from the parks. It burns through neighborhoods, people's homes, their businesses and schools. And it's only then when they go into their town hall and ask, or better yet, beg them for a permit to rebuild, and they're told there's no more single-family homes in their area. It's only then that the light goes on.
Here's President Trump. He is deplaning from Air Force One. He's at Beale Air Force Base in California. He's there to survey fire damage from the raging wildfires. So far, they've killed 75 people, Leland.
But when President Trump blamed the fires on poor forest management, apologists of sustainable development pilloried him, stating that forest fires are being caused by global warming, not 30 years of Agenda 21-inspired restrictions on timber harvesting, fire breaks, prescribed burning, and tree clearing.
We've been barred by Democrat policies from building what's called fire breaks and controlled burns. And the president points this out, and the controlled media goes, he's crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And they cut to a clip of him saying they need to cut the brush out. They need to cut the weeds out. They need to create lanes so the fire doesn't jump over. And they go, man, he's really crazy. No one's ever heard of that. He's making it up.
The forest fire, especially in the U.S. context, is absolutely has nothing to do with climate change. It's mostly caused by the government poor management of all these wildland areas, not allowing trees to be cut down so you serve as a fuel for fire. Any amount of dryness, this is clearly a management issue that is poorly managed. And I would say that if you want to find blames, I mean, the government is the one to be blamed.
Preeminent conspiracy researchers claim that recent wildfires in California, such as the 2017 Tubbs Fire and the 2018 Camp Fire in Paradise, were started or intensified with concentrated energy weapons.
What we see in these fires is entirely a different pattern. We are seeing the plant life act as the resistance to the fire, and we are seeing things that would ordinarily resist fire burn down to white ash. It is actually very similar to some of the patterns that we saw on 9/11/2001. And it would not be out of the realm of the imagination to think that this may be what is referred to as scalar interferometry weaponry.
A haunting but mesmerizing scene from the wildfires in Sonoma County. A man came across this tree burning from the inside out. The tree appears to be hollowed out by embers and flames.
I highly recommend the work of Thomas Bearden. People who are familiar with the work of Nikola Tesla should look into what Tesla did with scalar waves. And I think it's very possible that these types of directed energy weapons or concentrated energy weapons not only have been actively developed by covert factions of our military-industrial complex, but it's very possible that we may have already seen them deployed and used in test circumstances.
If Americans don't wake up, Agenda 21 and its most recent spawn, the Green New Deal, will destroy not only our natural resources, but our entire constitutional republic.
Well, the Green New Deal is a fascist plan for environmental policies to control all human action. Now, most people wouldn't think that some socialist congresswoman in New York could be labeled a fascist. But there's nothing new in the Green New Deal that Adolf Hitler was not doing with respect to his green movement in the German hills.
The Green New Deal is not, they say it's all about being fair and equitable and blah, blah, blah. But let me ask you, who's on, pictured on glue? Elmer. The clue is in the glue. All these wonderful byproducts that come to us by cattle. Carbon. My teeth are carbon. And they want to tax carbon under this Green New Deal. And they also want to get rid of fossil fuel. And you know what? For all those who are saying, you know what? Keep it in the ground. Keep it in the ground. That is their saying when it comes to fossil fuel and putting it back in the ground. Somebody's pacemaker that keeps them alive right now is made of plastic, which is made from fossil fuel. I guarantee we will get portions of the Green New Deal because our Congress, our House, our Senate, they're not standing up to this. They're wimping out, and it's frustrating. It's so frustrating.
It will eliminate private property and especially real estate ownership. It will destroy locally elected representative government. Free markets and individual freedom will all be gone. Most decisions will be made by agents of a global government hell-bent on protecting the environment in the name of equality and sustainable development. In short, the policies of the UN's radical agendas will increase worldwide poverty, decrease educational standards, increase world population, and decrease national and global security. The United Nations is not ushering some new world order as advertised. It is reinstating the old world order, an order where the rights come from the state, not the deity, an order where unarmed citizens are helpless, hapless, and hopeless as their governments rape and pillage them with excessive taxes, steal their private property, and mass murder them in the name of national security. An order of top-down governments commanded by dictators, sultans and oligarchs, kings, queens.
The greatest thing that our founders did when they created our constitutional republic was to say, you know what? Let's stop being a kingdom. Because we've noticed that no matter how much you limit a king, when you call somebody a king, at the end of the day, he's going to act like one, and people will always act like subjects. Let's be a constitutional republic. We created the new standard for liberty. The expanded rights of the people would be something that would spread throughout the world. What's interesting is, as we forget history, we steer ourselves towards the exact same thing our founders tried to keep us from. We have created an oligarchy in the judiciary by talking about how the Supreme Court issues rulings and makes law. We have created an oligarchy in Congress where we've established that the people believe that Congress can issue any law that they can pass by a majority. We've nearly created a kingdom with the enormous amount of power that has been transferred to the office of the executive.
I think that if the people in this country were to recognize the necessity of getting back to the founders' plan, if they were to do that, that would throw a massive monkey wrench in the plans of the globalist oligarchy, because they want disarmed populations that are easy to control, and they want solidification of power. The more power is solidified, once again, easier for them to control. And they have a few people to control at the top rather than the entire population. The last thing they want is that for the power of the purse and the sword, of money or military power to be diffused among the people. That's why they don't want sound money, that's why they don't want a militia.
Yes, the New World Order proposed by the UN power elite is nothing less than global totalitarianism.
The idea of total control from the top down, the elites, the royalty, the monarchs, with the peasants and serfs at the bottom serving their masters above. This is as old as the hills. But the new part is, in the old days, they used to administer their power and their control over the people at the point of a sword, with weapons and military power. Today, they're doing it with control of the mind and economic power. So in that sense, it's new. It's the old relationship, but being brought about with new weapons, the weapons of mind control and economic power.
To this, you may say hogwash. This movie is presenting nothing more than conspiracy theories. Time will tell. But consider this. Consider the mechanics of establishing a world government and review what is actually happening.
I think to answer that question, we just need to open up our daily newspapers and see how it's developing. Because we already have world government. It's not fully developed, but it's greatly developed. We see right now that the so-called leaders of all the nations get together quite regularly at international conferences and meetings, and they share ideas and they come up with plans and strategies. And all the nations seem to go along in lockstep. The philosophy in all of the nations of the world today, I can't think of any exception, is collectivism. It's hard to find much differences between countries anymore, except in the degree to which they have gone toward collectivism. Every day that goes by, there's more government power, more taxes, more internationalization of that power, and fewer personal liberties.
By definition, a world government is a superstate. Instead of having 195 independent countries, as we now have, a world government would be one country run by one centrally planned global government. What F.A. Hayek warned us about in The Road to Serfdom.
The United Nations is an attempt to create an umbrella organization with all of the nations still existing as nations, although some of their authority has been siphoned off by the United Nations. So the United Nations has not quite reached that goal. I'm sure that that's the ultimate goal of the people behind it, is the nation states will disappear. They will simply become districts or appendages of the United Nations as the single world government. So you will have essentially one nation as we now understand it, which has one government and control over territory, but that government will control the entire territory of the entire world.
A world government, if such a monstrosity were ever to come about, would look very like the government of communist China, very like the government of communist Russia. All the institutions of world government, the United Nations itself, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Law of the Sea Conference, there are dozens of them now, the International Labour Organization, I could go on listing them forever. Not a single one has its governing board elected by the peoples of the member states of the United Nations who created that body. The essential pre-qualification for any such thing is that that government should be elected by the members of all the states parties to the treaty creating that particular entity. And you can imagine how unpopular it would be in places like communist China if they were made to conduct elections for a world government, when the people would say, well, why can't we have elections for the government in China? And it is precisely for that reason that no world governing entity, of the ones I've mentioned, is elected, because the communists won't stand for it.
The criterion for consolidation would be mineral resources, land, water, air, cultures, languages, ethnicities, or even by local government jurisdictions. This is already happening with COGS, also known as Councils of Government.
World government has always proven itself to be the worst of the worst in terms of political systems. All of the global powers of history have been antithetical to the principles of freedom and liberty
They rule by brute force. They do not recognize the rights under God of the individual. They believe the state to be supreme. They believe the state to be in the place of God, literally. We are more free when we are more sovereign as a nation. The more we acquiesce to those global institutions, the more freedoms we lose, the more of our constitutional form of government we lose. And so the best thing that the American people can do is totally reject America's involvement with any of these global institutions.
The Great Seal of the United States, which was put together in the 1780s, contains the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is New World Order. The history of our country was very, very shaky at the beginning, and thanks to George Washington, we survived the impact of that, but they haven't gone away. They're still working at it, and we have to be on guard.
No matter what the criterion for global government's consolidation, what's known as regionalization, it would mean the end of borders, hence the end of national sovereignties.
Regionalization is this means of taking over whole areas of county commissions and so forth, getting multiple communities, multiple counties into this, under a same umbrella. And what it does is it changes our system of government. Non-elected, appointed people are making decisions, and they have literally usurped the power of local elected communities. You elect, say, a city council that you want to run your community this way, but oh no, you're in this whole collection of counties. They have applied for the grants. They have are making the rules, and so you can't make that decision. So that means it doesn't matter who you elect. They're in charge, and they're going to do what they want to do.
Regionalism is where they take, for example, in the Bay Area, the One Bay Area Plan or Plan 2040, 101 cities and 9 counties, and put them under a comprehensive smart growth plan. The power of we, the people in the United States, is that we have a voting system where we get to say, wait a minute, you representative, you're not representing me anymore, I'm voting you out. If you're in a small town and you're now part of a larger town and that's part of a larger region, your vote, your power as we the people disappears.
The radical left is already calling for this as it champions the millions of immigrants that have entered the U.S. illegally. This is happening now on the U.S.-Mexican border. And if the UN's agenda is fully implemented, you can bet the U.S.-Mexican border will no longer exist and mass migrations will be the order of the day.
So, without foreigners getting inside in a country, it's really a problem for the country. I'm talking about intellectuals also, but also people who are going to work in our farm, people we're talking about people from Latin America coming here illegally, going back, bringing the money back, but they're doing a lot of work what Americans don't want to do it. Long if they're not criminals, if they want to work. Yeah, wonderful. I think there have to be solution for people what want to come in this country, work certain amount of the time, go back. They don't have to be punished for that. Kick out all criminals. Work out on education for all people here and people what coming out here to be educated. It doesn't matter if they're legal or legal.
If the UN's agenda is fully implemented, you can bet the U.S.-Mexican border will no longer exist and mass migrations will be the order of the day.
In order to have a new world order, as they like to call it, which is, all pretty much the same, all nations the same, and all rules and regulations with the same concepts of what is right and what's wrong, the same judicial system and all of that sort of thing the same, you have to eliminate the differences. Of course, that's axiomatic. So Up until fairly recently, there have been substantial differences between nations based on culture, primarily. Well, it's necessary to get rid of those differences if you're going to really build a new world order. What better way than mingle the populations, bring mass migration from one area, put it into another area, and dilute the whole thing. It's like a big stirring pot. So that, in my view, is pretty much what the motivation is behind this mass migration movement, is to dilute and to literally destroy any firmly identified cultural differences so that what is left will be easily malleable into a unified, so-called one world state. Now that leads to a condition where there's so much chaos, and the average person is so frightened by it that they will be grateful for martial law. This is the end game, in my view, of what's going on with this mingling, quick mingling of conflicting cultures, is to bring about chaos at such a level that it'll seem justified. And thank goodness you did that, government, to bring in martial law to quell the violence. Of course, once the martial law is established, it will never go away.
At least when there's an evil dictator, that human is going to die. But for an AI, there would be no death. It would live forever. And then you'd have an immortal dictator from which we can never escape.
Why do you think the globalists, embedded in the Democratic and Republican parties, as well as the deep state and the mainstream media, are fighting over the wall Trump wants to build? The wall represents a barrier to mass migration, and mass migrations are part of the regionalization one would find prior to the establishment of a global government.
Regionalism in America is primarily focused upon the implementation of the COG agenda, the Council of Government agenda. Again, councils of government are everywhere. The Bay Area has the most advanced council of government in the nation. It is the elimination of the election of local government. That is what dissolves the American Republic. And when you were in grammar school, at least in my era, we learned the most important facet of American government isn't what DC does. It isn't even what Sacramento does. It's what happens in your local community. And today, regionalism has been engulfed with this concept of councils of government, which puts local government into a position where it's implementing, without electoral accountability, globalist plans for ultimate inculcation into world government.
Regionalization is an interim step to full globalization, and so it empowers the city-state or the mega-region. And most people are completely unaware of the mega-regions. There are 50 states in the United States, but there are 11 mega-regions. Specific locales that are huge cities are actually joined together. So you might have the Northern California mega-region, which goes from Northern California, extends into Nevada and into Washington. And then the Northern Washington mega-region actually goes into Canada. The Southern California mega-region extends into Mexico. So you're breaking jurisdictional boundaries. It's not the entire states that we're talking about. These are portions of states and portions of countries. You actually break the jurisdictional boundaries. So you can destroy the ability of individuals to have representative government.
Again, this is all happening now. The writing is on the wall. Look at NAFTA, short for North American Free Trade Agreement, a regional trade law. This already happened. NAFTA was signed into law by Bill Clinton, the same rogue that signed Executive Order 12852 to unleash Agenda 21 across all federal agencies. NAFTA was a trade bill designed to bleed the U.S. dry in the name of social equity, one of the 3 E's of sustainable development discussed earlier.
Social equity will not only fundamentally transform the United States of America, but all countries. It's about being fair and equal according to the United Nations and Agenda 21. Fair and equal. Okay, so does that mean that I can't sing? I'm a terrible singer. But other people can make lots of money off of their ability to sing. So under this, what is my payment under Agenda 21 and social equity? Since I can't make money from my voice because it's terrible, how is the government or the governments, how are they going to repay me?
Under UN Agenda 21's NAFTA scheme, the United States has been deindustrialized, its middle class almost destroyed. The fact that this has happened under the watch of not only the UN's World Trade Organization, but the Democratic and Republican parties is proof that the governing elites in these entities are attempting to sabotage the United States. Many would call this treason. The mechanics of establishing a world government are happening all around us. Is this hogwash?
We can see this in our daily lives. We are seeing high-rise buildings housing more and more people concentrated into cities and being drawn out of rural areas. We are seeing cameras pop up on every street corner. There are literally millions of cameras watching our every move. Smart meters, which are being installed on our homes every day, are measuring our energy use. And by that, the power companies can understand what we're doing. If we're using our hairdryer, the amount of energy we're using is showing up in their monitors. These are just 3 examples of how the implementation of the one world government is already happening.
What we the people must do to stop Agenda 21 is, first of all, be educated about this thing. Number 2, do not be silent about it. Let the people know what we are facing in regard to our country.
Since its founding in 1945, the United Nations has adopted a number of missions leading up to the rationale for Agenda 21 and its twin ugly sisters, Agenda 2030 and the Green New Deal. These missions could be boiled down to prevent war, remedy poverty, reduce population, protect the environment, stop global warming, stop the climate from changing. Some would agree with some of these missions, but what many disagree with is the means by which the UN proposes solutions.
What they really want to happen is a chance to implement the Marxist mechanism. Because in the name of doing all of these good things, now we can redistribute the wealth, we can take away personal liberties, we can do all of these things, and that's really what their goal is. But they'll never say, well, my goal is to take away your personal rights and force you into a high-rise, or you have to depend on me for your clothing and your job and your health care. That's what I want. That wouldn't go over too well. That's it. What I want is, I want peace and prosperity and equality and brotherhood. These are propaganda statements, so that you will trust them, you will give them the power they want, you will pay the taxes they demand, and when you're all done, you will be in shackles.
We have seen that the UN's Declaration of Human Rights makes no mention of key human rights: petition, unreasonable searches, probable cause, speedy trial, trial by jury, due process, excessive bail, or even a free state. But most alarming is the fact that nowhere in the UN Declaration are the words keep and bear arms, militia, or private property, as used to refer to real estate. What kind of an organization fails to mention private property rights and self-defense? Now's the time to ask yourself that question.
The most essential principles of natural rights are your inalienable right to secure your own life, your own liberty, and your own property. What they're actually doing is hiding behind a title and creating a society of slaves and masters. Because if you do not have a right to secure your own life, if you do not have a right to secure your own property, then you are enslaved to whomever you're relying on to do that for you.
Only a Marxist organization would fail to guarantee its constituents, whether people or nations, the right to keep and bear arms and the right to own and register private property.
You see, that's what's wrong with the human rights agenda for the United Nations. They establish government as the masters over the people, where the U.S. Constitution establishes the people are the masters over government.
Given this, and a long chain of other abuses, the United States should resign from the United Nations and suggest that all other nations that believe in private property rights and the right to keep and bear arms also resign. If the principles of capitalism, free enterprise, and individual responsibility really are better than the principles of socialism, central planning, and collective punishment, then let that be demonstrated to the world.
But we don't even have that. We have crony capitalism, which is corporatism here in the United States and really worldwide, anywhere where they say capitalism is practiced. Certainly, we wouldn't want to descend down the path of socialism, because that will take us into totalitarianism even faster, because that is the central control of resources and the distribution of those resources by the state itself. So you're going into a much more totalitarian direction when you go toward the direction of socialism and central planning.
We had a League of Nations, then a United Nations. Maybe humanity now needs an international forum based on the 10 amendments in the U.S. Constitution, rather than the 10 planks in the Communist Manifesto.
I think we establish a new body, international, but much more limited in its scope. And this would be the United Democracies. And only those countries who regularly elect their governments by universal secret ballot should be allowed to belong. That way you exercise constraint and you prevent the body from being captured, as the UN has been captured by communists. Any constitution that loves its people enough to allow them to vote for the governing class, that and only that should be allowed to belong to the United Democracies.
Agenda 21 is a United Nations plan launched in June of 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Billed as a plan to address global environmental issues, Agenda 21, in effect, is a plan to dominate all aspects of human life by placing a command and control structure around all planetary resources. Under Agenda 21, the U.S. Constitution, American national sovereignty, and constitutionally guaranteed inalienable rights would be eliminated and replaced by a secular, Marxist world order controlled by a power elite of multinational corporations, international bankers, and NGOs. Already, due to Agenda 21 and its spawns, we have seen the destruction of the American middle class, stagnant wages since 1971, and a deindustrialization of over 50,000 factories across the United States. GATT, NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, the North American Union, and the European Union are all spin-offs of Agenda 21. These free trade laws have transferred trillions of dollars out of the U.S. and into communist and socialist third world countries, as well as communist China.
You know, there are a lot of things that are considered to be unsustainable under this Sustainable Development Plan. One of those things, of course, is your unrestricted use of water and energy. Because, you know, you're going to have to pay the true cost of water, which could be a huge amount of money. And this is the way that you restrict individuals in their use, is that you raise the costs of whatever it is that they're using to a point where they're not able to use these things anymore. This will be restricted and is in fact now being restricted under the United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development Plan.
Under the banner of social equity, one of the pillars of Agenda 21, massive redistribution of wealth has already rendered many of America's activities unsustainable, hence targeted for elimination by 2030. Among these activities are single-family homes and suburban communities, crop irrigation, pesticides, and commercial fertilizers, livestock production and most meat consumption, privately owned automobiles and especially the internal combustion engine, fossil fuels for energy production, personal travel, and air travel, most forms of mineral extraction and timber harvesting, dams, reservoirs, golf courses, ski lodges, and vacation resorts. Human population, such slated for reduction below 1 billion people.
The globalists' true agenda for Agenda 21 is control of the population of the planet. Now they know that they can't control 7.5 billion people, so what they want to do is reduce the population of the planet to under 1 billion, a far more controllable number. When they have done that, they think the billion that they will have wound up with will be concentrated in these megacities, easily surveilled, and therefore they will basically be able to control all of humanity.
Although Agenda 21 was never ratified by the Senate as required by law, 95% of all federal regulations are tied to UN Agenda 21 as sustainable development policies that target American sovereignty and the American dream.
Agenda 21 targets the sovereignty of any nation and every nation in which it operates. The ultimate goal of the United Nations through Agenda 21 is to transfer as much sovereignty from a particular nation to the United Nations as is possible.
Agenda 21 is a direct threat to the U.S. Constitution because it erodes national sovereignty, it erodes state sovereignty and local control. You have a third party, a foreign element, coming into the towns and counties and cities and implementing something that was written up at a meeting in Rio de Janeiro in 1992.
Either the U.S. Constitution is exceptional or it isn't. If it really is exceptional, should we, the people, encourage the other 194 nations of the world to follow a Pied Piper of some Marxist world order? Or should we offer something better? Let's see how many of the 195 countries on Earth will migrate over. Millions, if not billions, already want to migrate, emigrate, and even sneak into America. We must have something the world wants.
Well, obviously, we don't like the idea of a global government. We don't like the idea of a powerful few running mankind. We like the idea of nationhood, and we always have. So we have all my years working as originally a young staffer in the Birch Society and working my way up the ladders and becoming president of the society for about 20 years. Our attitude is very simple. If we can wake the town and tell the people the conspiracy will be opposed, then we won't have to worry about it anymore.
I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon.
It's time to cut off the head of the beast. Sure, take state and local action, but Agenda 21's cancer may have spread too far into the U.S. body politic. Thus, as the John Birch Society has been advising for decades, get the U.S. out of the UN and the UN out of the U.S.
The United States should withdraw from the United Nations. I think the United States should expel the United Nations from U.S. soil. So I'm always very much in agreement with that philosophy as articulated so well by the John Birch Society over the years. The UN has produced nothing positive for the United States, in my view. The United Nations, of course, is an attempt at globalization. So when you look at the principles and the ideals of the United Nations and compare those to the principles and ideals of America, they are polar opposites.
So yes, if we removed ourselves from the United Nations would find itself in rather difficult circumstances. And I think we should, because the United Nations in most respects has failed to do what it promised to do. And it has advanced a socialistic program everywhere in the world that it's had an opportunity to do so, which is directly contradictory of our way of life and our governmental system. So we're essentially in the position in remaining in the United Nations and promoting its activities and financing its activities in essentially undermining our own way of life.
Capitalism creates wealth. Socialism creates poverty. The Frankfurt School's long march through cultural institutions has almost destroyed American academia, the media, and even the clergy. The United Nations' long march through the economic and political institutions has almost destroyed free market capitalism and limited government.
This nation is the greatest republic on the earth because we have had a written constitution that has helped us to keep at bay the avarices of men in power who want to concentrate power into their own hands.
Let us be clear. The source of human rights is God, not the state, not the UN. The individual is supreme, not the group. Humanity advances through voluntary action, not coercion. Property is owned privately, not by the state. No one should have a monopoly on a nation's choice of money. Laws should be equal for all, not favor the power elite. Power should be wielded for defense only, never hate or aggression. Leadership should be by persuasion, not by coercion. The UN's agenda is a smokestack technology. The world needs fusion, solar, and probably Tesla technologies. The youth need hope and opportunity, the kind only a free state with an exceptional constitution can deliver. Any other agenda is an agenda for world domination, a Marxist world order. Any other agenda is an agenda the founders of the United States would find totally and completely unsustainable.